In the city of gold and whispers, where daughters are bartered like spices in the market, one woman dared to bloom unseen. Layla was the last choice among the merchant's daughters. Quiet, overlooked, invisible. But when the most powerful sheikh in Egypt chose her above all others, the silence shattered. What did he see in her that others ignored? And what secret binds their fates beneath Cairo's sun-soaked walls? A past debt, a hidden room, a love tested by power, grief, and rebellion. Before we begin, tell us, where are you listening from today? And one more thing, do you believe true love can be chosen over duty? You're about to find out. Cairo, Egypt. The year was 1871. The sun poured its golden breath upon the narrow streets of the old quarter, gilding domes and dust alike. The call to prayer drifted through the air like silk on the wind, mingling with the scent of cardamom, roasted almonds and rosewater. Beneath the tiled arches and shadowed colonnades of the Al-Najjar residence, time seemed suspended, held still by tradition, by duty, and by the quiet presence of a young woman who had learned to live in the periphery of her own story. Layla Al-Najjar moved without noise. She did not glide, nor command, nor sparkle like her elder sisters, Amira and Yasmina, whose laughter chimed like silver bracelets as they paced the upper halls, surrounded by fabrics from Constantinople and perfumes from the Levant. Layla, the middle daughter, dwelled in stillness, her sanctuary the rose garden their mother once tended before illness dimmed her light. There, Layla's hands caressed the earth not as a servant would, but as a daughter seeking fragments of memory in the soil. She wore a dress of soft pistachio green linen that caught the light only when she stepped into it. The sleeves rolled neatly to her elbows, the hem kissed by dust. A simple ivory scarf veiled her hair loosely, allowing waves of dark chestnut to peek beneath. She did not embellish herself with coral beads or golden bangles. Her only adornment was the faint stain of rose oil at her wrist and the quiet certainty in her gaze. While Amira rehearsed her smile before polished brass mirrors and Yasmina debated which brocade would best capture a prince's eye, Layla nestled among her mother's climbing roses, reading verses of Ibn Hazm beneath the branches. The words were old, older than Cairo, and tasted of longing. Love is what you cannot see, yet it steals your sleep and your breath. She read slowly, lips parted in silence, unaware of how the light danced on her cheek or how stillness could be more alluring than performance. That day, the household stirred with exceptional anticipation. The arrival of Sheikh Khalid al-Farouk, a hero of the southern provinces, a man whose victories in tribal diplomacy had earned him both reverence and mystery, was to be celebrated with an elaborate reception hosted by the governor. The Al-Najjar daughters, like many of Cairo's finest young women, were expected to attend in dazzling attire, perfumed and poised. It was known that the sheikh, though widowed and wrapped in enigma, was seeking political allies through marriage. He would undoubtedly choose a bride. Layla had not been invited. Instead, she was entrusted with overseeing the shipment of saffron jars in the rear courtyard, and making sure the servants prepared the baskets of dried dates for the governor's kitchens. She did so without protest. She had long understood that her silence served as a balm to her father's pride, a pride already bruised by debts and diminished status. A daughter who did not complain was a daughter who did not cost him more. As twilight fell and lanterns glowed amber against the courtyard walls, Layla stepped out briefly to deliver a last bundle to the driver. That was when she heard it, a thud, muffled and heavy, followed by a cry. At the edge of the alley behind the garden wall, a soldier had fallen. His uniform bore the insignia of the governor's guard, and his leg was twisted beneath him, blood darkening the edge of his robe. Panic flickered in his eyes. The man's skin was pale from pain, his breath ragged. Without hesitation, Layla dropped to her knees beside him. Her hands, steady and deliberate, tore the edge of her linen scarf and pressed it against the wound. She murmured something, soft, low, comforting, not with the timbre of command, but of presence. He stared at her, stunned by her calm. Within moments, 2 more guards arrived and pulled him away, but not before one turned back with a frown. "You there? What's your name?" She did not answer. She only nodded and returned to the shadows. Unseen by her, above the garden's stone arch, beneath a curtain of climbing jasmine, Sheikh Khalid al-Farouk stood. He had arrived without the usual parade, preferring to observe the city before stepping into its arms. And it was there, in that in-between moment, that he witnessed what no other man in the celebration halls had. A young woman with bare wrists and dirt-stained hems, kneeling before a bleeding man, unflinching. He said nothing, but his gaze lingered. Long after she disappeared into the garden, he remained there, still as the marble at his back. Later that night, as Yasmina twirled to the sound of strings and Amira recited borrowed poetry before silk-draped nobles, Layla sat by the rosebush her mother had planted the year she was born. Her book lay forgotten in her lap. Her fingers brushed over the petals, and for the briefest of seconds, she wondered if roses bloomed for those who remained unseen, or if they, too, longed to be chosen. She closed her eyes, not knowing that someone already had. The morning sun rose over Cairo like a promise draped in silk, soft, golden, and deceptive. Merchants opened their stalls along the winding streets, brushing dust from faded awnings and calling out the virtues of spices and silks. In the Al-Najjar household, however, the day broke not with the rhythm of commerce, but with a flutter of anticipation that clung to every breath, every gesture, every rustle of fabric behind closed doors. Rumors had arrived before the dawn, carried on the lips of servants and whispered from the mouths of fruit sellers and perfume peddlers. Sheikh Khalid al-Farouk is searching for a wife, but it would not be a love match. It would be a decision of strategy, of influence, of unspoken treaties and ancient debts. A bride, not for the heart, but for the future of alliances long buried under sand and pride. By mid-morning, Cairo had transformed into a theater of expectations. In every household of standing, daughters were being dressed as though their very lives depended on the shade of their kaftan or the shimmer of their eyes. Within the Al-Najjar estate, chaos reigned in silence. Yasmina paced the marble hallway in a gown of sapphire silk, her eyes darting to every reflective surface. Amira sat on a divan, fingers nervously plucking the edge of her veil, her expression carefully trained in graceful indifference. Layla, seated beneath the terrace, listened. She was not meant to be present for the conversation that followed. The voices floated from the men's salon like the distant echo of drums before a battle. Her father's voice, hoarse with uncertainty. A visitor's voice, low, deliberate, unmistakably measured. Though the words were blurred, their weight reached her spine like cold water. A servant passed by with a bundle of polished tea glasses, and not seeing her, muttered, "The sheikh came with guards." Not many, just enough to make it known he is not here for courtesy. Layla's gaze lifted instinctively. Somewhere beyond the courtyard's olive tree, behind carved doors and latticed panels, the man whose eyes had followed her in silence 2 nights before was speaking of marriage. Not to her, of course not to her. Her sisters had been dressed since dawn, Amira in blue to complement her pale complexion, Yasmina in coral to catch the eye with color. Both were told to smile, to speak little, and to let their presence do the work. Their father had assured them both would be presented to the sheikh during the midday audience, but when the doors opened, only one name was called, Layla. A stillness heavier than thunder swept through the house. Layla, who had not worn silk. Layla, whose fingers still smelled faintly of crushed mint and jasmine water. Layla, whose scarf was modest, whose eyes lowered in every room. Her name, spoken in the deep voice of the family steward, struck the air like a blade. "Layla bint Hussein al-Najjar, the sheikh requests your presence." Amira's gasp was sharp and loud. Yasmina's fan fell to the ground. Their father froze mid-step, his face blanching as though a ghost had appeared at his door. Layla did not rise immediately. She blinked once, then twice, trying to decipher if the words had been said aloud. When they were repeated, and all eyes turned to her, she stood slowly. She did not smooth her robe, did not adjust her scarf. Her movements were steady, quiet, unhurried, like the deep current beneath a calm river. The steward led her to the receiving chamber, where thick carpets lined the floor and brass lamps cast halos upon the ochre walls. The scent of sandalwood hung in the air, and in its midst stood Sheikh Khalid al-Farouk. He was dressed not in ceremonial robes, but in the simplicity of a man accustomed to command. His kaftan was of dark indigo, unadorned save for the subtle embroidery along the cuffs. His belt held no weapon, yet there was something sharpened in his presence, as if the blade lived within the man himself. His eyes, darker than ink, rested on her with a quiet that did not waver. Not cold, not warm, just present. He spoke first. "Miss Layla." She lowered her gaze in greeting. "Sheikh Khalid, I am here with purpose. I do not believe in wasting words." She nodded once, a small movement. Controlled. "I seek a wife," he continued, "not for pleasure, not for ornament, for alliance, for stability, for the future I am asked to shape, whether I desire it or not." He paused, and only then did his gaze deepen, searching hers. "I have seen many women, heard many promises, but it is your hand I request." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the lamps seemed to stop their flickering. Layla did not speak, not out of shyness, but because something ancient had unfurled in her chest, as if her own name had been spoken not by a man, but by fate itself. "May I ask," she said finally, "why me?" Khalid's jaw shifted slightly, the only sign of tension. "I do not answer to curiosity," he said, "but I honor it in you." He paused, then added more softly, "Because I know a flame when I see one, even when it does not scream to be noticed." His answer offered no romance, no poetry. Yet Layla felt something tighten in her throat, something close to disbelief, but closer still to dread. Was this pity? Was she to be the consolation prize, the safe choice, the symbol of an old debt repaid? She did not ask. Not then. "I will speak with my father," she said. Khalid inclined his head once. Not a bow, not arrogance, just the exact amount of gravity one offers to someone whose strength they do not wish to diminish. The door closed behind her like a whisper, but the weight it left upon her shoulders was thunderous. In the hours that followed, the house trembled beneath the surface. Her father paced without direction. Her mother, frail and silent for weeks, sat up and asked to see Layla's face. Amira wept behind closed doors. Yasmina refused to speak. Layla waited in the rose garden. Her father came at dusk, his eyes sunken, his voice thick. "He has the power to destroy us, Layla, and perhaps to protect us." "You owe him something," she said softly. He looked away. "I see." Her voice did not shake. "Then I am the coin." He tried to protest, but the truth had already bloomed. Like the roses behind her, it could not be pressed back into bud. And yet, when the time came to decide, Layla did not hesitate. She stood in the courtyard where the last of the sun painted her face in amber and said, "I accept." Not for her father, not for her sisters, not even for Khalid, but for herself, because she would rather be chosen with mystery than dismissed with certainty, because something in the sheikh's gaze had not been pity, but recognition, and because even the invisible daughter deserves to write her own fate. And that night, as Cairo's lanterns lit the sky and strangers murmured her name in disbelief, Layla stood alone at the edge of the garden, the rose petals whispering around her feet. She would marry the most powerful man in the region, and no one, not even herself, knew what that would truly mean. The sun had barely risen when the carriage pulled away from the Al-Najjar household, its wheels cracking softly over the cobbled stone of the old city. wrapped in silence and dust. Cairo watched as Layla departed, neither escorted by a crowd nor showered with blessings. There were no wedding drums, no petals cast upon the road, no sisters waving farewell from the balcony. Only her mother, pale and seated in the shadows behind a wooden screen, had whispered a parting prayer. Her father did not appear. The sheikh, already mounted on horseback, had not spoken beyond a nod. And so Layla left the world she had known, not as a bride draped in triumph, but as a woman bound for uncertainty, dressed in soft indigo and bearing her mother's rosewater scent on her skin. The road unfurled before them like a scroll of secrets. As the city faded behind sand-colored hills, Layla held her hands together tightly, not in fear, but in fierce composure. She did not cry. She did not speak. The sheikh rode ahead, his figure rigid beneath the morning light, his turban casting a sharp line over his face, obscuring all but the stoic set of his mouth. It was late afternoon when they reached the estate. Khalid al-Farouq's home did not rise like a palace. It emerged from the earth like something ancient and earned. The walls were stone, not marble. The towers were low but firm, like watchmen holding back time. Beyond the front gates, the estate opened into an inner courtyard surrounded by colonnades and fig trees whose leaves trembled with the breeze. There were no fountains singing, no servants bustling to welcome her. Only silence greeted Layla as she stepped down from the carriage and faced the place that was now hers, by name if not by heart. The silence was not peace, it was memory. Inside, the halls were wide and high, with ceilings carved in dark wood and windows shuttered from the heat. The scent of musk and old cedar clung to the walls, interrupted now and then by incense trails that rose like ghosts from unlit corners. A large tapestry of deep burgundy hung across the main stairway, its threads faded in the center, as if touched too often by unspoken hands. Servants moved like whispers, barely audible, barely visible. They bowed to the sheikh and regarded Layla with eyes that flickered, measured, and quickly turned away. No one offered her a hand or a word. A young boy with almond eyes carried her small chest to a room on the second floor and left it without a glance. Layla stood in the threshold of her new chamber. It was spacious but not indulgent. A large arched window overlooked the southern garden, now dry and overgrown. The bed was carved from dark walnut, adorned with linen sheets, plain but immaculately pressed. A mirror leaned against the wall, covered by a thin gauze. A basin of cool water waited on a side table. No roses, no fragrance, no music. She turned and met her reflection in the gauze, blurred, faint, as if she had not fully arrived. Later that evening, a soft knock came at the door. Layla turned, expecting perhaps a maid with tea or a message from Khalid. It was neither. An older woman entered, her back straight despite the weight of years in her joints. Her robe was plain grey, her scarf tightly wrapped. Her eyes were sharp, too sharp to belong to someone invisible in a place so silent. "I am Noura," she said, without a bow. "I manage the household." Layla inclined her head. "Your supper will be brought soon. The sheikh does not dine in company." Her voice was neither hostile nor welcoming. "Do you require anything?" "No," Layla said softly. "Thank you." Noura watched her for a moment longer, then turned to go. At the door, she paused. "There are rooms you need not enter," she said. "This house remembers what it has lost. Best not to disturb its grief." Layla looked up. "Which rooms?" But Noura was already gone. Days passed like wind through linen, soft, fast, and directionless. Khalid was nowhere to be seen except in fleeting glimpses, leaving the stables at dawn, cloaked in brown, walking across the upper veranda in silence, flanked by two advisors. His voice, once, echoing down the main hall during a discussion too distant for her to hear. Layla wandered the estate cautiously. She did not want to intrude, yet the emptiness called to her. The rooms were grand but cold. One salon remained untouched, the furniture covered in cloths, the air stagnant. She touched nothing, Then she found the door. It was on the second floor, near the end of a corridor bathed in shadow, where sunlight never quite reached. The door was painted in deep green, its wood old and smooth. It was locked. She touched the handle once. Cold metal. Beneath her palm, a shiver. Behind her, a sound, a sharp breath. Noura stood at the other end of the corridor. "I told you," the woman said quietly. "Some grief prefers to be left alone." Layla withdrew her hand. That night she could not sleep. The silence of the palace had begun to throb, not in her ears but in her chest. A kind of pressure, a tension unspoken. The air carried not life, but memory, and memory, she realized, was heavier than stone. Her thoughts drifted back to Cairo, to the moments that had led her here. Her father's unease, the way his voice had caught in his throat, his refusal to meet her eyes when the proposal came. There was something there, something unsaid. She rose from the bed and walked to the window. The moonlit courtyard below shimmered like silver silk, and there, beneath a fig tree, stood Khalid, alone. He stared upward, not at her but beyond. His hands were behind his back, his posture still. There was no soldier beside him, no advisor whispering in his ear. Just a man, rigid, silent, locked in something he did not name. Layla did not speak, did not move. She watched him from the shadows, the way one watches a story unfold in silence. And in that moment she wondered, was she living inside a house of mourning or inside a man's unfinished memory? The question lingered, unanswered, as he turned and disappeared beneath the colonnade. And Layla, alone in a palace of shadows, felt the first whisper of fear, not for what he might be hiding, but for what she might find if she dared to open what remained locked. The morning sun rose like a brass disc above the low rooftops of the estate, casting long shadows across the worn stone of the southern courtyard. The wind carried with it the scent of sand and distant fires, a foretaste of the journey to come. The desert called, not with violence, but with a slow, solemn insistence that stirred something ancient in the bones. Layla stood beneath the arcade, her veil pinned securely beneath her chin, the folds of her linen riding cloak fluttering at the edges. She had not been told where they were going, only that she must be ready by dawn. No reason had been offered, no blessing spoken, just the sheikh's voice, calm and unyielding the evening before. "We ride at first light." She obeyed, though her heart stirred with questions. The caravan was modest in size, but carried the weight of quiet authority. 4 guards rode ahead, wrapped in burnouses of faded indigo. 2 attendants managed the supplies. Khalid rode alone at the front, his figure erect and unmoving, his horse black as ink and obedient to the lightest touch of rein. Layla mounted her mare with quiet grace, her fingers brushing the leather saddle worn by time and use. As they rode out of the gates, the palace behind them seemed to exhale, as if relieved to release its silence. The road gave way to dust by mid-morning, trees became shadows, and shadows became memory. The color of the world faded to ochre and rust. And still, Khalid did not speak. Layla rode behind him, her eyes following the movement of his shoulders, the stillness of his profile. He was like the desert itself, unbending, measured, filled with a presence that resisted interpretation. By the second day, the earth no longer pretended to offer shade. The heat wrapped around them like a second skin, dry and relentless. Yet Khalid never complained, never faltered. He spoke only when necessary, to the guards, to the attendants, never to her. And still, she watched him. At dusk, they reached a small village built into the rock. Simple clay homes with doors of bleached wood and windows covered in woven reed. Children ran barefoot in the dust, and goats wandered without aim. A man with a silver beard greeted Khalid with bowed head and pressed hands, offering water and food without ceremony. Khalid accepted the invitation to rest, but declined the communal tent. He slept beneath the stars, his head resting against a rolled blanket, his eyes never quite closing. That night, Layla sat near the fire with the women of the village. She spoke little but listened. She heard of dry wells and failing harvests, of tribal tensions and old wounds that had never healed. One child, barely more than 4 years old, lay curled in her mother's arms, shivering beneath a blanket, sweat beading across his tiny forehead. The women murmured in worry. The healer had died the month before. The child's father had ridden west to seek herbs, but had not returned. No one knew what to do. Layla stepped forward without asking permission. Her fingers moved with care, unwrapping her small satchel of dried leaves, powdered bark and rose oil. The women watched her, uncertain, but did not stop her. She brewed a small infusion with water heated over the fire, crushed seeds between her palms, and rubbed oil into the child's chest in circular motions, murmuring soft words from her mother's tongue. The child whimpered, but his breathing steadied. One of the women whispered, "She has her mother's hands." Another added, "No, her own." Khalid watched from a distance, seated on a low wall beneath a tree stripped bare by wind. His face remained unreadable, but his gaze never left her. By dawn, the child slept peacefully, his fever broken. The village women gathered around Layla, not as strangers, but as kin. They offered her tea, bread, and embroidered cloth as tokens of thanks. She accepted them with humility, tucking each gesture into her heart like a thread in her own stitching. Later that morning, as the caravan prepared to leave, Khalid approached her alone. She turned before he spoke, sensing his presence before hearing his steps. "You did not hesitate," he said. Layla's eyes lifted. There was no one else. There were many, but only you moved. She looked away, brushing a wrinkle from her sleeve. It was a fever, nothing more. "No," he said quietly. It was more. The silence between them was delicate, like silk pulled taut. Khalid's voice dropped. "You are unlike any woman I've known." Layla did not smile. "And yet you chose me." He did not answer. She waited. Still, he said nothing. Something flared in her chest, not anger, but something dangerously close to it. She took a single step forward, the hem of her cloak brushing his boots. "I have wondered every day," she said softly, "why you asked for me. You have not offered affection. You offer no warmth, and yet I am here." His eyes darkened. "Do you regret it?" he asked. She inhaled slowly. "I regret not understanding." Khalid looked at her for a long moment. Then, with a sigh barely heard, he turned his gaze toward the horizon. "There are things," he said, "that are not spoken easily. Not because they are shameful, but because once they are said, they cannot be taken back." Layla felt her breath catch. "You chose me," she whispered, "but not as a woman to be loved. I was chosen for another reason." He looked at her then, truly looked, and for a heartbeat his gaze flickered with something raw, something human. "You were chosen," he said, "because in a city full of noise, you moved in silence. Because where others displayed their virtues, you revealed none. And in doing so, you revealed everything. Because strength does not always shout." He stepped back, the distance between them growing again. "But if you seek romance," he added, his voice steady, "you will not find it in me." Layla's lips parted, not in surprise, not in hurt, but in understanding. "I do not seek anything," she said, "only truth." And with that she turned away. The desert wind rose as they departed, lifting the ends of her veil like wings. The rose oil at her wrist had faded, but its memory clung to her skin. And though Khalid did not speak again that day, he watched her from behind as they rode, watched the woman he had tried not to notice, yet could no longer ignore. Because in the vastness of the desert, beneath the endless silence, something had begun to bloom. And it was not in her, it was in him. Cairo greeted them, not with ceremony, but with heat and whispers. The journey back from the southern provinces had left dust in the seams of Layla's cloak and silence in her chest. The desert wind had stripped something from her, perhaps her innocence, or perhaps the illusion of safety. Yet Cairo, with its domes rising like mirages and streets pulsing with the noise of life, offered no comfort. It felt smaller now, tighter, as if the city itself knew that she no longer belonged entirely to it. The palace gates opened, creaking on their ancient hinges, and Layla stepped down from her horse with a composure carved from habit. No hand reached to assist her, no eyes met hers. The servants resumed their stations, and Khalid disappeared into the shadows of the upper halls, his back straight, his words few. Her chambers smelled of lavender and stone. A pitcher of cool water waited on the washstand. The linens had been changed, and yet something in the air felt foreign, unfamiliar. She set down her satchel and walked to the window, pressing her hand against the carved wooden lattice. The city breathed beyond, loud and unknowable. Later that evening, as the sun dipped behind the rooftops and the palace corridors fell into their nightly hush, Layla wandered through the west wing, drawn by a thread she could not name. The tiles beneath her slippers were cool, and the lamp she carried trembled slightly in her grip, its flame flickering as if sensing her unrest. She had not meant to stop beneath the gallery that overlooked the private library, but she heard them, two voices, male, low, sharp in tone and shadowed by long memory. She never should have been offered, one voice said. It was brittle, impatient. The debt was your burden, not hers. She was not offered, came the other, calm, measured, Khalid. Oh, please, don't dress it in virtue. You took her to stop Rashid. You know it. I know it. Hussein al-Najjar promised her years ago. That's why Rashid's silence had a price. Now he wants revenge. A pause. I did what I had to. Did she know? Silence. Layla's breath caught. The flame in her lamp stilled, frozen mid-dance. She was never supposed to know, Khalid said at last. She backed away before they could hear her, her fingers clenched tight around the brass handle, the ache in her chest sharp and sudden. Promised to Pasha Rashid, a man known for ambition and cruelty, whose name made even powerful merchants lower their gaze. Her father had promised her, and Khalid had intervened, had claimed her not from choice, but from necessity, a transaction masked in solemn words. She returned to her chambers like a ghost. The mirror above the basin reflected her features, pale beneath the lamp's glow. She studied herself, the curve of her cheek, the firmness in her jaw, the stillness in her eyes, and saw not a wife nor a woman. She saw a coin, a favor repaid, a name spoken in backrooms, scratched into agreements made between men. Later, as the palace settled into silence, Khalid came to her door. She opened it without speaking. He stepped inside, his expression unreadable, the lamplight brushing the edges of his cloak. He stood as though he expected resistance, but not refusal. You heard? It was not a question. Yes, she said. He bowed his head slightly, but not in apology. You were promised, she whispered, her voice steady despite the fire in her throat. Like a parcel, like a field, like a debt. It was not a real betrothal, he said quietly. Nothing was signed, but something was spoken, she said. Something bartered. He did not deny it. I intervened, he said. I couldn't allow Rashid to take you. You know what he is. And what are you? She asked. That made him look at her, truly look, and for a moment the stillness between them cracked. I am not a man who saves women, he said. I am a man who protects what cannot be defended by law. You were vulnerable. He would have broken you. Her eyes burned. So you broke me first. His jaw tightened. I chose you, he said. But yes, there were reasons. Reasons I am not proud of. Reasons that began long before I saw you. She stepped back. So, when you watched me in the garden, when you stood silent as my name was called, it was not fate, it was convenience. No, he said, it was the first moment I realized I wanted you, but I had already taken the step. She turned from him, her back straight, her breath shallow. You could have told me, she whispered. You should have. He did not speak. "I thought I was becoming something here," she said. "Not just a wife in name. I thought I was beginning to exist." "You are," he said, and the words fell from his mouth like stone. "You are the only one in this place who is fully awake." She closed her eyes. "It doesn't feel that way." He hesitated, then said, "I cannot undo what was done. But you can speak the truth," she said. He nodded once. "And I will." When he left, she stood for a long time in the center of her chamber, listening to the echo of his steps retreating into the distance. The silence he left behind was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of a name written in dust, erased by the first wind strong enough to rise. She lay on her bed but did not sleep. Instead, she stared at the ceiling and tried to remember what it felt like to be untouched by bargain, by promise, by power. But that memory, like her name in the dust, had already begun to fade. The days that followed drifted like smoke through the corridors of the palace, thick with a silence that refused to lift. Layla moved through them as one walks through fog, aware of every step, every breath, yet unsure of direction. Her once quiet soul, once content with observation, now churned with questions that refused to die. She withdrew, not in anger, nor in pride, but in mourning. Not for Khalid, nor even for herself, but for the illusion that she had been chosen freely, for the belief that perhaps her presence in this palace had been born of something more than negotiation and necessity. The rose garden she had begun to tend remained untouched. The books in her chamber stayed closed. The windows remained shuttered, denying both the sun and the city outside. When servants came, she nodded but did not speak. When Noura entered, Layla offered polite silence. And when Khalid passed her in the hall, on the rare occasion that he did, she did not lower her gaze, but she did not offer her voice either. He did not insist. Then, without warning, an invitation arrived. Written in elegant Arabic script, sealed with dark wax and bearing the emblem of the crescent, Pasha Rashid was to host a formal banquet in honor of recent trade negotiations with the southern provinces. All major households and political figures were expected to attend. Khalid's presence was not only requested, it was required. Layla's presence, however, was merely welcomed, a suggestion, a dare. The message was delivered by a guard who did not meet her eyes, then placed gently upon a lacquered tray by Noura, who said nothing but lingered longer than usual before turning to leave. Layla stared at the invitation for several long minutes. She knew what it meant. It was not hospitality, it was a stage, and she was being cast upon it. That evening she dressed with slow precision. Her fingers moved without trembling, choosing a gown of dark garnet silk with gold-threaded cuffs, high at the collar and fitted at the waist. Her hair, always kept in simple braids, was coiled at her nape in a loose chignon. Soft strands left to frame her face. A single bracelet of her mother's clinked gently at her wrist, a circle of polished ivory and bronze. She said nothing as Khalid entered the main hall, already dressed in a formal robe of black and deep blue. Their eyes met for a fleeting second, then they rode together in silence. The banquet hall was a fortress of opulence. Lamps hung from carved cedar beams, casting golden light on walls tiled in lapis lazuli and mirrored glass. The scent of orange blossom and roasted lamb mingled in the air, too rich to be comforting. The guests were adorned in finery, turbans jeweled with emeralds, caftans embroidered with gold, silk veils that shimmered like water. And at the far end of the hall, like a spider at the center of its web, sat Pasha Rashid. He rose when Khalid entered, offering a smile that cut like a blade. "Sheikh al-Farouk," he said, "and the Lady Layla, how the desert winds do carry surprises." Layla's breath caught, not because of his words, but because of the way every pair of eyes turned toward her, measuring, judging, smiling without warmth. They were seated at a long table, set beneath a vaulted ceiling of carved stone. Layla sat beside Khalid, her spine straight, her fingers resting lightly on the linen napkin in her lap. The first courses were served: stuffed dates, seasoned lentils, lamb with saffron and figs. Wine was poured, though Layla declined. She ate little. The conversation turned to politics, trade, military presence in the border provinces. Then came the pivot. "And tell me," Rashid said, his voice like velvet dipped in vinegar, "how fares the lady in her new home? It must be quite the change. From jasmine stalls and spice crates to marble halls and locked doors." Layla did not blink. "I have always known how to walk quietly through any room," she said, "whether in a garden or a palace." A few at the table chuckled politely. Rashid leaned forward, his smile widening. "And yet," he said, "I imagine it must sting, knowing you were once promised elsewhere, old debts and such. But I suppose silk draped over silence is still silk." The words hung in the air. Layla's hand closed around her napkin. Before she could speak, Khalid did. His voice was low, but the room stilled at its tone. "Careful, Pasha." Rashid raised a brow. "I mean no offense. You mean only to humiliate what you could not possess," Khalid said. "But be warned, what you dismiss as silence may yet echo louder than your power ever has." A hush fell. Khalid stood. Layla rose slowly beside him, her chin lifted, her eyes never once leaving Rashid's. They left the banquet without another word. The night air outside was cooler than expected, scented with myrrh and city dust. The carriage ride was silent, but the silence was no longer empty. Back at the palace, Layla walked ahead of Khalid through the stone corridors until he spoke, quietly but firmly. "Come with me." She hesitated, but she followed. They ascended the stairs, passing shuttered halls and shadowed niches, until they reached the door at the end of the north wing. The door Layla had once touched, the one Noura had warned her about, the one that had remained locked until now. Khalid drew a key from within his robe and slid it into the lock. The sound was soft, but final. He opened the door. The chamber was dim. Dust floated in the air like ash. A small window let in the faintest moonlight, illuminating the outlines of forgotten furniture, a child's wooden horse, a woman's veil folded neatly on a chair. A tiny sandal lay on its side beneath a low table. Layla stepped inside. Khalid remained near the threshold. "She died in this room," he said, "both of them, fever. I was away on campaign. I returned too late." The words were heavy, stripped of poetry. "I could not bring myself to change it, or to destroy it." Layla said nothing. She crossed to the window, letting the moonlight touch her face. Then she turned. "They are not ghosts," she said gently. "They are memory. Memory is not something to be feared." He looked at her, not as a man looks at a woman, but as a man looks at a truth he had buried and now must live beside. "Why did you show me this?" she asked. "Because you needed to see where my silence lives," he said. "And because you deserve to know that I see you not as a bargain or a shield, but as the first thing I've let myself trust in years." Layla felt her chest tighten. She stepped closer. He reached for her hand, not with urgency, but with reverence. His fingers barely brushed hers. She didn't pull away. Their eyes met, and in that fragile space between grief and understanding they kissed. It was not fierce, it was not triumphant. It was a whisper, a prayer, and though it carried the weight of sorrow, it also carried something else, a beginning. The morning after the kiss unfolded like the petals of a rose at first light, tentative, quiet, and trembling with promise. Layla woke not with certainty, but with a new breath in her lungs, as if some hidden chamber within her had finally been opened. The shadows that once clung to the corners of the palace no longer seemed as heavy. The silence no longer cut, it merely waited. She stepped into the courtyard just as the first call to prayer drifted across Cairo's rooftops. The air smelled of earth and dew. Her slippers sank lightly into the dust as she approached the farthest wing of the palace, the place her feet had avoided out of habit, out of grief, out of reverence. It had once been her mother's garden. What remained of it was skeletal, Dead vines clung to cracked wooden trellises. Stone paths were lost beneath weeds. A fig tree leaned heavily in one corner, its branches bowed as though mourning. The scent of old jasmine clung faintly to the air, but there were no flowers. Layla did not hesitate. She bent to the earth, pressed her fingers into the soil, and closed her eyes. The tears came, not of sadness, but of release. For all the words she had not spoken, for all the roots pulled from her life before she could name them, for the girl who had once sat beneath her mother's roses, believing she was invisible. She began to work. At first, the servants watched her in silence from the archways. A noble woman, a wife, on her knees in the dirt, her sleeves rolled up, her hair escaping its pins. Some turned away, others whispered, but she did not stop. By the second day, the younger maidservants began bringing her buckets of water. One left a basket of dried seeds near the garden wall without a word. By the end of the week, the palace cook arrived with a satchel of basil and lemon balm. Noura, silent as always, began appearing at dawn, sitting just out of reach with a pot of tea between them. It was a quiet revolution. With each stone removed, each vine untangled, Layla felt something within her take root. Her fingers no longer trembled. Her voice, when she gave instructions, carried not volume, but gravity. Soon, word spread beyond the palace walls. Women from the nearby village began to arrive, not to look at the garden, but to speak with the woman who had once cured a fevered child. They came with ailments, bruises, questions. Layla welcomed them not as a mistress, but as a sister. She opened a room near the garden gate, stocked it with herbs, linens, salves, and patience. It became her mother's legacy, and her own. And Khalid? He said nothing. But each morning before she arrived, the path had been swept clean, tools sharpened, the water well filled. Once she caught him watching her from the upper terrace, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Their eyes met. He did not speak, but he nodded, and that was enough. Until the day a storm arrived, not of wind or sand, but of ink and accusation. Layla was tending the lavender beds when she noticed a servant boy, young, no more than 10, standing at the edge of the colonnade, his face pale, his hands shaking. "My lady," he whispered, "you must come." He led her through the winding halls to the vestibule where a courier awaited. Dust covered the man's robe. He looked weary and ill at ease. Layla took the scroll without ceremony, broke the seal, read. Her breath stopped halfway through the second line. Hussein al-Najjar, arrested, charges of financial deceit and collusion, detained under the authority of the imperial court, immediate effect. She read it again, and again. The words did not change, but the world tilted beneath her feet. She did not run. Layla did not run. She returned to her chamber, removed her garden-stained robe, dressed in dark blue silk, fastened with gold buttons her mother had once sewn, pinned her veil tightly, and walked, head high, to Khalid's private study. He looked up as she entered, already holding the letter. "I only received it minutes ago," he said. Her voice was steady. "You knew it would come." "No," he stood, "but I feared it might." She crossed her arms over her chest, her eyes locked on his. "What aren't you telling me?" "I will find out who signed the decree," he said. "But I have no doubt Rashid's hand is in it." Layla's voice grew quiet. "He doesn't want my father. He wants me." Khalid said nothing. "Why?" she demanded. "Because I humiliated him. Because I left the place he tried to claim as his. Because you threatened the order he controls," Khalid said. "Because you are more dangerous now than ever before." A knock interrupted them. It was a servant Layla barely knew, a young woman, usually silent and hesitant in her presence. But now her voice trembled with urgency. "My lady, I must speak quickly. I heard the steward. Rashid has been sending letters. One of them mentioned your name, not your father's. Yours." Layla's blood turned cold. "He intends to remove the roots," the girl continued. Not just the branches. The words struck like lightning in a summer sky. Later, Layla stood alone in the garden. The fig tree's leaves rustled gently in the wind, whispering a language only she could hear. She pressed her hand to the trunk. Her father was not a perfect man. He had traded in secrets. He had bargained daughters like coins, but he was hers, and she had grown from him for better or worse. She would not let him fall. Not like this, not without a fight. As the light faded and the muezzin's call rose across the rooftops, Layla knelt in the soil once more. But this time, she was not planting flowers, she was planting resolve. Because the garden may have bloomed again, but war had already taken root. The city of Cairo had never felt so vast, nor so silent. As Layla stepped through the stone archway that led to the courthouse courtyard, her breath tightened. The morning was heavy with heat and tension, the kind that made even the birds fall quiet. The call to prayer had long faded, and now the streets were lined with onlookers, merchants, mothers, students, soldiers, each drawn not by curiosity but by the scent of scandal. And at the heart of it stood her father's name, wrapped in accusations darker than ink: financial deceit, treason, collusion with foreign agents. It was not only his reputation on trial, but hers, Khalid's, the fragile dignity they had built, thread by thread, gesture by gesture. Now it all hung by a thread, held in place by the word of Pasha Rashid, the man who had already stripped them of peace. Layla's steps did not falter. She wore no jewelry, no gold pins, no decorative belt, only a deep emerald cloak with embroidered cuffs and her mother's pendant hidden beneath the folds of her veil. Her hands were gloved, her posture straight, her silence sharper than a blade. Inside, the courtroom echoed with murmurs. Stone columns reached toward a vaulted ceiling, casting long shadows on the polished floor. At the center stood a raised platform where 3 imperial judges sat, robed in deep red, eyes hidden beneath folded hoods. Pasha Rashid, adorned in embroidered silk, stood to one side with his entourage, arrogant, composed, victorious before the judgment had even begun. And on the opposite side, in chains too heavy for his withered frame, stood Hussein al-Najjar, Layla's father. His beard had grayed. His face looked drawn, his lips cracked, but his eyes searched the room until they found her, and when they did, they softened. Layla sat beside the public gallery, her back stiff against the carved wood of the bench. No one addressed her, no one expected her to speak, but they had underestimated her. The proceedings began. Rashid spoke first, his voice slick with false humility. He recounted evidence of fraudulent accounts, of transactions made in the name of alliances that never existed. He produced forged letters, misinterpreted ledgers, even false witnesses, men paid in silence or fear. The merchant al-Najjar, Rashid said with grave concern, has betrayed the integrity of this city, and he is not alone. Others too have benefited from this deceit, the sheikh who married his daughter among them. A stir moved through the chamber like wind through tall grass. Layla's jaw clenched. The judges conferred briefly, murmuring in low tones. Then the lead judge asked, "Is there anyone here who wishes to speak in defense of the accused?" Silence, until Layla rose. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Rashid turned, a smile tightening at his lips. The judge eyed her. "State your name." "Layla bint Hussein al-Najjar," she said, her voice steady. "And your relation?" "I am his daughter," she said, "and the wife of Sheikh Khalid al-Farouk." The judge glanced at his companions. "Very well, you may speak." Layla stepped into the center of the room, the hem of her cloak brushing the polished floor. She stood beside her father but did not look at him. "I am aware," she began, "that I am not expected to speak, that I am not a man, that I hold no office, but what I do hold is memory." Her voice did not tremble. "I remember the days when my father worked from sunrise to midnight, managing goods, negotiating debts not for glory, but for survival. I remember the moment his name was dragged through dirt, by those who feared his influence. And I know this. If you accuse him of treason, then you accuse the hands that built this market, the hands that clothed and fed half the quarter you now claim to protect." Rashid scoffed. "Spoken like a merchant's daughter." Layla turned to him. "And how would you know, Pasha Rashid, what it means to earn your name instead of inherit it?" A sharp murmur swelled from the crowd. The judge raised his hand. "Enough. Lady Layla, do you have evidence to support your claims?" She paused. "No," she said. "Only my word." Rashid smiled again, condescending. "And we're to rewrite the law for sentiment?" "Perhaps not," said a voice from the doorway. "But the law remembers its debts." All heads turned. Khalid stood in the entrance, cloaked in black, his eyes like obsidian beneath the hall's lanterns. He walked forward without hurry, his boots echoing against the stone, the authority in his presence enough to make every breath pause. He approached the judges and bowed. "I request to testify." Rashid bristled. "You are not named in this matter." "I am now," Khalid replied. "My marriage to Layla al-Najjar was not merely political. It was born of an obligation and of truth." The judges nodded once. "Proceed." Khalid stepped to the center of the hall, his hands clasped behind his back. "Years ago, during a tribal negotiation gone awry near the southern border, I was ambushed, wounded, alone. I was taken in by a caravan master who recognized me but asked no questions. He saved my life, fed me, hid me from my enemies. When I asked his name, he refused to give it, but I learned it anyway." He turned toward Hussein. It was him. A hush fell so complete, it seemed to still time itself. "My marriage to his daughter was not a favor to him. It was a way to settle a debt I had no other way of repaying. But in choosing her," Khalid continued, his voice softening, "I discovered I was not repaying anything. I was beginning something." He faced the judges. "Whatever dealings occurred after that were mine alone. My decisions, my power, my responsibility. And if you must judge treason, then judge me." The chamber exploded in voices. The judges banged their staffs. Rashid stood frozen, his confidence draining from his face. One of the judges leaned forward. "Do you have proof of this event?" "I do," Khalid said. He reached into his robe and withdrew a small, faded scroll. "A tribal contract written in my hand, signed in blood. It was never filed in Cairo. It was kept safe, for a moment like this." The judge examined it, nodded. The other judges conferred again. The hall was tense. Then the lead judge rose. "This court finds the accused, Hussein al-Najjar, not guilty. The charges are dismissed, and Pasha Rashid," he looked sharply at the man, "will be investigated for abuse of office." Rashid's face blanched. The courtroom erupted. Layla did not move. Her father's chains were removed, his shoulders sagging with disbelief and exhaustion. Khalid did not approach her. She looked at him, heart full, eyes unreadable. Later, as the sun dipped behind the city's domes and lanterns flickered in the streets below, Khalid found her on the terrace. "I meant every word," he said. She nodded, arms crossed over her chest. "But you hid every truth until the moment it served you," she replied. He exhaled. "Yes. And now?" she asked. "I want no more secrets," he said, "only what we can build." She looked at him for a long moment, then turned her gaze to the horizon. The city lights shimmered. But her answer remained unsaid. The wind rose with no warning. It came from the east, sweeping over the desert like a whispered curse, carrying dust, silence, and something darker, something charged. By midday, the sun was swallowed by a shroud of copper clouds, and the light turned to ash. The estate groaned softly under the pressure of the wind, its wooden shutters rattling, fig trees bending like mourners before a grave. Layla stood by the arched window of her chamber, her hands gripping the carved lattice, eyes narrowed against the swirl of sand rising on the horizon. The sky had turned the color of old brass. The heat pulsed low and heavy, and yet she felt cold. Below, the palace stirred. Servants ran across the courtyard, securing doors, covering water basins, tying down the animals. The gardener she had come to trust gestured to a young boy to hurry into the kitchen halls. Dust spun like smoke between the pillars, and the rose garden shuddered as petals were torn loose and scattered into the wind. But there was something else, a stillness beneath the chaos, a silence more deafening than the storm itself. It was not just weather. Layla stepped back from the window and crossed the room with purpose. She tore off her soft shoes and wrapped her hair tightly in a cotton scarf. Her heart pounded, not with fear, but with a strange clarity. Instinct hummed in her blood. A warning. She had just fastened her cloak when the knock came. It was not Noura. It was one of the guards, his face drawn and streaked with sand. "My lady," he said breathlessly. "Men approach from the southern ridge, armed, no banners. The storm covers their path." Layla's breath caught, but her voice remained steady. "How many?" "We cannot tell," the guard replied. 15 at least, maybe more." "Rashid," she whispered. The guard bowed his head in grim confirmation. "The sheikh is already at the gate." Layla did not hesitate. She followed the guard into the corridor, where the air was already thick with dust. Tapestries fluttered violently on the walls, and the faint scent of smoke, distant and acrid, clung to the corners of the stairwell. When they emerged into the courtyard, the wind struck her face with grit and fury. Her eyes watered, but she kept moving. Khalid stood by the main gate, his cloak billowing like a black flame. He gave orders in a calm, clipped tone, his men moving quickly to reinforce the wooden doors with iron braces. Sentries loaded rifles and unrolled extra sacks of sand to brace the perimeter. Layla approached him, and though her voice was nearly lost to the wind, he heard her. "What do you need me to do?" Khalid turned, startled, not by her presence but by the absence of hesitation in her voice. "You should go inside," he said. "No," she replied, her eyes locked on his. "This is my home too." A flicker crossed his face. Admiration, fear, something deeper. "Then you'll help the injured," he said at last. "We'll hold the courtyard. If they breach the walls—" "They won't," Layla interrupted. "They'll try, but they won't." He nodded once, and then they parted, not with farewell, but with shared purpose. The wind roared louder. The first shots rang out. The attackers descended in bursts, shielded by the storm, blades flashing in brief glimpses through the dust. Khalid's men fought with precision, every movement a response to chaos. Layla watched from behind a half-collapsed wall, her hands moving quickly to bind a man's leg with torn linen, her voice low as she whispered comfort to a boy no older than 15. In the kitchens, women screamed. In the west wing, windows shattered, and yet Khalid stood firm. Even when blood ran down his left arm, even when a blade grazed his cheek, Layla saw him stumble. Something broke in her then. Not panic, not terror, but a fury that felt sacred. She rushed to his side, slipping through the heat and smoke like a thread through a needle. "Khalid!" she cried, her voice hoarse. He turned, face streaked with sweat and dirt. "Go back!" he shouted, but she didn't. She stepped forward and pressed a linen soaked in rosewater to his wound. Her hand shook, his breath caught. They stood there, storm swirling, the air between them thick with dust, blood, and something unspoken. And in that instant, when the estate teetered between ruin and survival, Khalid reached for her hand. "I should have said this before," he whispered, "but I was a coward." Layla shook her head, tears cutting clean lines through the grime on her cheeks. "Not now," she said. "Not here." "Yes," he insisted. "Now. Because if I fall, I won't fall with silence in my mouth." He drew her closer, not with force, but with urgency. "I love you," he said, "not as part of an agreement, not as a way to repay a debt. I love you because, in the middle of my darkness, you saw light, and you didn't look away." Layla trembled. "I was afraid to believe you'd ever see me," she whispered. "But I did." He nodded, his forehead resting against hers for a moment of stolen stillness. "Then believe this too," he said. "I want to walk beside you, not ahead, not above." She closed her eyes, and when she opened them, the storm seemed quieter. "I believe you," she said. By nightfall, the attackers had retreated, scattered by the returning guards and the force of the wind. The courtyard was bruised, but still standing. The wounded were carried to the inner hall, where Layla knelt, washed hands red with effort, guiding the younger women through triage with a calm voice and steady gaze. Khalid reappeared long after the fires had been extinguished. His arm bandaged, his face solemn. They did not speak until the house had stilled. He led her, hand in hand, through the quiet corridors and down into the garden. The wind had died. The roses had survived. Moonlight poured over the garden like silver rain. The fig tree stood tall. The petals fluttered softly in the breeze, catching on Layla's hem as they crossed the path. Khalid stopped before the arbor her mother had once tended, now fully in bloom. "I have no priest," he said. "No scribe. No audience." Layla smiled faintly. "You have me." He took both her hands. "Then let this be enough." They stood beneath the arbor, surrounded by scent and silence, and exchanged no promises bound by law, but vows bound by truth. "I choose you, Layla," he said. "Not because I must, because I want to, not as a shadow behind me, but as the light beside me." Layla pressed her forehead to his. "And I choose you, Khalid, not because you rescued me, because I became myself beside you." The petals above them shifted, some drifting down between their shoulders like confetti from the heavens. There was no music, no celebration, only two hearts, no longer guarded, no longer waiting. And as the moon rose higher and the roses swayed in gentle approval, Layla felt the past loosen its grip. She was no longer the invisible daughter. She was a wife of her own choosing. And Khalid, once hardened by silence, had found the voice that could love her. In the garden, under the stars, their union was rewritten, not with ink, but with breath. The morning light filtered through the carved stone lattice like golden lace, casting patterns across the floor of the courtyard. The air was crisp, sweetened by the scent of citrus blossoms and the lingering trace of rose petals that had fallen in the night. Cairo had entered its season of stillness, when the heat softened and the streets exhaled with quiet grace. Layla moved through the garden in silence, the hem of her robe brushing against the gravel path. The roses, once fragile, now bloomed in riotous color, deep crimson, pale ivory, violet streaked with copper. Each blossom whispered of persistence, of wounds healed in sunlight and root. The fig tree, once bowed with grief, now stretched proudly toward the sky, thick with leaves and heavy with fruit. She paused beside the arbor and pressed her hand to the wooden beam, warm from the sun. Beneath its canopy, she had once stood with Khalid and exchanged vows spoken not for spectacle, but for truth. And now, the garden bloomed as if it had remembered their words. In the distance, the sounds of the household stirred. A young servant girl laughed as she chased after a pair of doves near the well. A stable hand hummed a prayer as he brushed down the horses. Somewhere, Khalid's voice rang low and clear as he spoke with the estate steward, discussing shipments and grain. But for now, Layla lingered in the garden, letting the stillness wrap around her like a shawl woven of memory and peace. She carried a small satchel slung over her shoulder, filled with letters, sealed scrolls in colored ribbons, some delicate, others scrawled in haste, most of them sent by women. They had come from as far as Alexandria, from the coastal towns near Tripoli, from mountain villages where women still ground herbs by hand and whispered to one another in the hush of courtyards. They were seeking her, not the sheikh's wife, but Layla, her hands, her voice, her guidance. They wrote of daughters with fevers, of husbands who did not listen, of bruises left in places no one dared speak aloud. They wrote of loneliness and confusion, of childbirth and silence, of prayers whispered under their breath. They asked not for miracles, but for understanding, for remedies, for someone to listen. And she answered, one letter at a time, with recipes passed from her mother's journals, with words of comfort, with counsel that did not rise from pride, but from knowing. At the garden's edge stood a narrow structure built of warm stone and wood. Once a guest chamber, now transformed. Inside, it smelled of sage and crushed mint. Shelves lined the walls, filled with jars and scrolls and little muslin bags tied with thread. Women came each day, quietly, sometimes in pairs, sometimes alone. Some left with bundles of healing herbs. Others stayed for tea. Some wept. Layla greeted them all with the same tenderness. She did not ask for names if they were not ready to speak them. She did not judge silences. She welcomed them as she had once longed to be welcomed. Behind her, the palace had changed, not in stone or status, but in spirit. Khalid now walked its halls with a gentler gaze. He listened more than he spoke. When decisions were made, they were made with her. He no longer stood ahead of her in meetings, but beside her, shoulders level. Servants who had once bowed only to him now greeted her with sincerity, not obligation. Even Nara, ever silent, had begun to smile. And the room. The room at the end of the corridor, once locked in sorrow, now bore a new scent, powdered milk and cedar wood. Its windows were no longer shuttered. Sunlight streamed through gauzy curtains, painting the wooden cradle with light. On the wall, the veil once folded in mourning now hung beside a set of tiny slippers, embroidered by Layla herself in silver thread. It was not erasure. It was restoration. Not a forgetting, but a continuation. A knock came at the garden gate. Layla turned, her hand still pressed to the beam. Khalid stood there, dressed simply in a linen tunic and dark sash, his hair tied back, his hands clasped loosely behind his back. There was a quiet joy in his eyes, a warmth no longer buried beneath the ash of old grief. "Letters again?" he asked, nodding toward the satchel. She smiled softly. "A dozen today, from all corners. And you'll answer them all, as many as I can." He walked toward her, his steps slow, deliberate. "They no longer whisper your name behind your back," he said. She looked at him. "They speak it aloud," he added. "With respect, with hope." Layla's gaze drifted back to the roses. "Do you remember what I asked once? If they bloom for those who remain unseen?" Khalid nodded. "And do they?" he asked. She turned to face him, her eyes lit by the morning sun, her voice as steady as ever. "No," she said. "They bloom for those who dare to rise through the dust." He stepped forward, reached for her hand, their fingers intertwined with the ease of two roots grown side by side. Together they walked down the path, the wind rustling through the petals around them. There was no need for declarations, no need for titles or ceremony, because now, Cairo remembered. It remembered the woman who had once walked its alleys in silence, whose scarf smelled of rosewater, whose fingers had touched the wounded without fear. It remembered the daughter who had been bartered and had risen not in rebellion, but in dignity. It remembered the one who had once been invisible and who now could not be ignored. And Layla, she did not seek to be remembered. She simply lived, rooted, radiant, real. And in the garden that once held her mother's sorrow, now bloomed the legacy of a woman fully seen. The wind that swept through Cairo on that spring afternoon was softer than it once had been. The dust no longer clung as harshly to the stone walls, and the sun, though still bright and sovereign, seemed to shine with gentler hands. 8 years had passed, and yet, in the rose garden at the edge of Khalid al-Farouq's estate, time moved slowly. The fig tree was taller now, its branches thick with fruit and memory. The trellises overflowed with blossoms of every shade, the air saturated with the perfume of jasmine, thyme, and the unmistakable trace of rose oil, now a signature scent known across the region. Beneath the arbor, worn by years of wind and whispers, Layla sat on a carved bench, her hands folded neatly over her lap. A small book of pressed flowers lay beside her, its pages delicate with age. Her hair, streaked now with strands of silver, was braided simply. A violet scarf draped over her shoulders. There was grace in her stillness, a kind of majesty earned not through title, but through presence. She listened, Inside the nursery, tucked within the palace, laughter echoed, light and high-pitched. Children, more than one. Their twins, Samir and Noor, had just turned 7. He was bold and endlessly curious, his feet always dusty, his questions never-ending. She was quieter, but with her mother's eyes, piercing, tender, unafraid. And there was a third cry now, smaller, newer. Their daughter, Jannah, had been born in winter. Khalid had wept at her birth, holding the tiny bundle of warmth, as though he were afraid she might vanish if he exhaled too deeply. He had changed. His face bore deeper lines now, the sharpness of war softened by fatherhood and time. He still rode out each month to oversee the southern territories, but he no longer carried the weight of silence in his shoulders. In Layla's presence, he smiled freely. He laughed, not often but fully. They had loved quietly, fiercely, not with fireworks, but with the steady glow of a hearth that never went cold. They had argued too, about politics, about reforms, about how much land to dedicate to the garden. But they had always returned to each other. Always. Society had shifted around them. What began with a healing house for women had grown into a network of sanctuaries across Egypt. Midwives were trained with Layla's methods. Women from distant provinces wrote to her, sought counsel, offered ideas of their own. They called her Mother of the Morning. Not a queen, something deeper. Girls were no longer sold in silence. Some men, powerful once, had fallen into disgrace. Pasha Rashid had not vanished, but his name had dulled. After the trial, he was stripped of position. He fled north. Rumors said he tried to buy influence in Alexandria, but trust once broken rarely finds shelter. He died in quiet obscurity, without monument, without forgiveness. Noura, the quiet guardian of Khalid's home, had passed peacefully 3 years before. Layla had buried her beneath the fig tree, planting marigolds at her feet. On quiet mornings, she still spoke to her. And Hussein al-Najjar, Layla's father, had lived long enough to hold his grandchildren. He died with her hand in his, whispering the name of his wife, and asking if the roses had bloomed that year. They had. On this particular afternoon, Khalid stepped into the garden holding Jannah in his arms. The baby, barely able to walk, reached out toward a butterfly that danced near a rosebud. "She thinks she can catch it," he said, smiling. "She will," Layla replied. "One day." He sat beside her, their shoulders brushing. They looked out over the garden together, where Samir chased Noor between rows of lavender, their laughter bouncing off the stone walls like music. "You said once you chose me because I moved in silence," Layla said, watching them. "I did." "And now?" Khalid looked at her, the lines of his face drawn in sunlight and time. He kissed her hand, gently, reverently. "Now I choose you because I hear you in everything." The sun dipped lower, casting gold upon the leaves. The garden swayed with life. The past, its betrayals, its losses, its silence, had not disappeared, but it had been folded into the soil, turned into something that could blossom. Layla leaned her head against Khalid's shoulder. They did not need to speak. They had lived. They had been seen. And now, in the heart of a city that had once forgotten her, Layla remained, rooted in love, remembered in bloom. Some stories do not end. They take root, and Layla's is one of them. What began with silence became a journey of resilience, healing, and love, found not in grand declarations, but in quiet defiance and steady growth. Layla was once overlooked, bartered, forgotten, but through courage, wisdom, and unwavering dignity, she rewrote her own destiny and the fate of those around her. This is a reminder that even the most invisible among us hold the power to transform the world, not by shouting the loudest, but by standing tall in truth, love, and compassion. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to know, what was your favorite moment? Leave it in the comments below. And if you made it all the way to the end, write the word rose in the comments so we know you were here until the last petal. And don't forget, there are more powerful stories like this waiting for you in the cards and on our channel. Tales of forgotten women, impossible choices, and timeless love. Thank you for being part of this journey. Until the next story, may your heart remain open and may you never stop blooming.